Welcome back. It's your lousy Florida gardener. This state park opened in 1968. I had planned on doing a tour today of the museum and the Cracker Homestead. Due to circumstances, the museum is closed, but the Cracker Homestead is open. So we're going to go check that out first and do a little tour of that, take and see what it was like to step back into the 19th century, time before power, time before vehicles. Come on, let's go with me. As we come up to the gate, notice the style of the home, the surrounding buildings that you see in the backdrop. Notice that the place is surrounded with a picket fence. You see a fire chimney on either side of the home. So we'll open the gate and step inside. Notice the weight to pull the gate back. Sand, dirt, most debris was kept out of the yard. This was to prevent fires from reaching the house. The front porch extends far off, sitting on wooden blocks. Notice those shingles are made of wood. Let's take a little tour of the outside before we step inside. Front of the home. Notice on the front of this house, there are no windows as far as glass. What you see is wooden shutters that would fold back to be able to close it up. Chilly night, storms coming in. That's a side view. Fireplace on either end extends up. Now, this fireplace is sheathed in wood with the insulator in between. Not sure if that was just used for a mold or what. Now we're coming around to the back porch of the house. It's a rear view of the home. Pretty impressive from this angle. And there's a third chimney. This is a view of the home from the other side and the far end. So let's step back around to the entrance and we'll check out the porches first and discuss those. Porch ran the full width of the house. Get off and find chairs on these porches. Sometimes also find swings. People sit in the afternoon. Also would be where the immediate firewood would be stored for cooking and heating the home. Buckets of water that had been toted up from the hand pump for everyday use. And it wasn't uncommon to see some tools that may have been used every day that would be hanging on the walls or sitting on the porches of these homes. Maybe even a dog laying around. Tools used to maintain the property, saws, hooks for dragging, tools for working. Whatever might have been needed, they had to supply it for themselves. You'll notice there's two rooms with a central hallway, dog trot, the entryway. And in this particular home, the kitchen is built external off of the home, and that was a common trade of the era. So you'd enter the home through this dog trot. You'd step up on the porch. This would be your front porch. This would be that central aisleway in between them with the high roof that follows the home. Looking at the kitchen while we're standing in between, two bedrooms. Take a little better look at that kitchen. Now as we step toward the kitchen, you'll see we have another porch here that separates the kitchen. That kept most of this heat out of the house during the summertime. Most of the eating was also done in the kitchen. I'll give you just a little glance around, then we'll talk about it, what we're looking at here. They have it sectioned off so you can't really get inside. So let's look at the structure first and then we'll look at the furnishings. You'll notice a fireplace on that end. Table with the dishes. Now one thing that was common in this era were fireplaces, or in some of the more prominent homes, you had cast iron stoves. That's where all the cooking was done. If you'll notice too, there are no sinks in here. Most cleaning was done generally outside and was done with pans with water that was hand pumped. All water that was used in the kitchen had to be pumped in. Now something that was common in all these homes, most of them had what was called a pie safe, which is this item Usually wood with real fine screen or wire on the front to keep out animals and bugs, where baked goods were kept. You can see the lantern up there. It would have been used to give the place light. The extra dishes or maybe food items would have been kept in there, dehydrated items. They'd have ground their own sausage. They'd have shucked their own corn, made their own grits. You see the tools that they would have used. That would have been a stool. That would have been a stool that they'd have sat on maybe to churn butter or while the daughter was helping her mother. Now, as we step back toward the house, we're going to look at the 2 bedrooms. Most of these homes, all the children would have slept in one room. Let's step up here. Give you a little pan of the roof and the structure. Fireplace. So you see in this room, we have 2 beds, one over here, one over here. Deer antlers hanging on the wall, that would have been some supper. A sewing machine that would have been manual. There would have been no electricity. It would have been worked by that pedal on the floor. All these rocking chairs you see would have been handmade here on the farm. Butter churn. You see too, they also had their lanterns in this room. Jugs for keeping various beverages. And a wash pot for washing hands, mirror, different things they'd have needed to help carry out hygiene and start their day. So that is that room. Now we'll step over here. This would have more than likely been the man and woman of the house's room. You'll notice we have a bed here. On that side of our bed, we have a crib. Now, most of these headboards like this would have either been made here on the farm or may have been an inheritance piece or something they had brought over from their homeland when they came here and settled. This room would have had its own wash pot, small dresser. Also has its own fireplace. Musical instrument. Now these you don't see anymore. An armoire. These were really common. They were started off a lot smaller, brought over and used during the old West days because they could strap that on the back of a wagon when they were traveling from place to place and merely set it down, open it up and get to their clothes. They become prominent amongst the wealthy. So that is pretty much that room. So now we're going to exit the home. We're going to come out here and we're going to talk about some of the amenities that were used to supply life here on the farm. You have to remember they had to produce everything they needed or trade with some neighbors, and sometimes neighbors were too far away to trade with. So these homes were set up for that. Days were spent with all the families having different chores. There were no lazy people. The term, you don't work, you don't eat, really meant something in these days. So we're going to start here on the perimeter inside the fence, and I'll show you the basic amenities that are closest to the house that were used and what they were used for, and then we'll work our way out. Most homes had hand-dug wells that had been built. Later on in time, hand pumps become dependent, but at this time era, all water that would have been used around the home for anything, watering animals, watering people, bathing, cleaning, would have all come out of this well. It had to have been hand dipped and toted inside. That's why you've seen so many different type pots back in that area. They were used for toting water. Most homes in that era had some sort of berries or different food crops around them to produce their food, which they preserved. That would have been in this particular case, grape arbor. Now this is the outhouse. I want you to think about this. There was no running water and no lights. To do your business in the middle of the night, regardless of what time of year it was, freezing cold, storming rain, you would have got up, come out of that dog trot breezeway area, down those steps, and then walked out to the outhouse to do your business. Then when you were done, you'd have made the trip back to the house. It's the little things we take for granted. Most of these places had a bell. The bell actually served two purposes. A lot of these bells were not in the rear of the home like this, some were. The main purposes of these bells was not only to call the people to dinner, but if a neighbor or passerby pulled up and didn't find anybody, he could holler, and if he didn't get anybody, he could usually ring that bell and you could hear that bell for miles. So most homes had a bell of some sort. Some of them wouldn't just pull. It might have been a metal-shaped object that they hit on with another metal-shaped object, but most homes had one of some sort. Over here, we have a smokehouse. Smokehouse was critical. Remember, there was no power. So all food that was going to be procured for the winter and for the year had to be dried and seasoned. Pork was a big thing. The men got together during the cold days, killed pork, and then usually the women would prepare that pork for smoking and salt brining. All right, so just to give you a relation, we're standing on the back of the home. We're going to now exit out into where most of the food would have been produced. Lots of things would have went on the outskirts of these properties. You'd have had cane grindings. You'd have raised your own chickens so that you'd have had meat and eggs. You'd have raised your own cows, hogs where you'd have had pork. A lot of the homes that lived near the coastline, close to the coastline in this area, were known for catching mullet and smoking those in their smokehouses. So we'll slip through here now and I'll show you a few of these structures. Chickens in some areas would have run loose, and other areas would have been contained. Nothing too fancy really. You had to remember back then you didn't go buy chicken feed out of a feed store. You fed your chickens scraps, different things. And then during the day, you'd have went in, you'd have gathered eggs. Those type of chores and taking care of the chickens and animals generally fell on the children. There'd been different structures on the property to maintain the different livestock and animals that they had. But once again, most things had to be done on their own property. So you'd have had your own corral pens that you'd have built and maintained. It was not uncommon for most of these places to be up on pieces of logs. That's what they had to work with. And especially if they were storing food or something that rats or animals they had to worry about. They needed to be able to store their farm equipment and town equipment. Here you see two styles of wagons. This wagon would have been used to ride to town, ride to the neighbor's farm, wherever they may have needed to go that was just one person. They'd have hitched this to their horses. This wagon over here would have been used to haul stuff. There were several forms of these that had been modified. Some had boards across the front with seats on them, much like some of the old Pioneer wagons that you've seen. There'd have been various pens for protecting the different things on the farm. Structures that were used for multitudes of tasks. Said anywhere from storing corn to smoking food. All the shingles on these would have been handmade out of wood. During the later years, most of these places that had been inherited by their children and grandchildren, as developments come out, they improve some of these homes, and that's why you see a lot of the Cracker homes that we've seen that's left dilapidated had metal roofs on them. In the earlier days, there were no metal roofs. Every shingle on there was handcrafted here on the farm from trees out of the surrounding wood. Most of their money that they did was able to accumulate, which largely come from corn growth. was used to buy farm tools such as these. That way they could work and produce more money, produce the food they had that they needed. They had to keep parts. The last thing you wanted was during growing season, you bust a wheel or a bearing, something like that, and the nearest one may be in Georgia. Well, guess what? There was no FedEx or UPS. We didn't jump in the old Ford and run the town. We had to get on a horse and go get it. So they generally tried to keep common things that would break around the home for repairs. You can see the joints. All these would have been cut with hand tools. There were no gasoline chainsaws. We didn't plug up no power tools. All sorts of implements that were used on the farm. Now here's something that a lot of us have witnessed and been to. There's been a lot of that around this in our county here in Perry. Cane grinding. I remember going to cane grindings growing up. They'd have events there. You could taste cane juice, buy cane, syrup. This is what they call a cane press. On the end of it would have been some horses that would have walked around, and as they walked, the center sprockets would have turned as you'd have fed the cane through it and squeezed the juice out into the pan below that would have drained down. Unless you just didn't have horses for that, a lot of times people, children, the adults would take turns walking that around. So let's go out here first at the end. You'd have hooked your horse or mule or cow or wife or kid to this end. Now, these gears allowed this to be able to spin, and your cane would pass through here, crushing the juice out. They were adjustable, and that's the purpose. If you look at these holes in it, let me back up. If you look at them holes, you'll notice there's wedges in it. Just depending on which way you needed it to go, you could adjust it with your wedges, tilt the cant, whatever you needed to do. This pan underneath is where your cane juice, cane syrup, and juices would have flowed out. You can see on this side of that pan, they've made it a trough. So they'd have had buckets as the juice would have come out and run down, would have come out of here and run down into your pan, and it would have flowed down through here and into your buckets. Over here is where, once that was done and they had gathered their cane syrup and cane juice, they would bring it over and it'd be cooked down. Usually this was a big event. The children from the area would all be together playing. Adults got together. A lot of future marriages were started and formed at these type of events. So let's give you a little look up here. We have a trough, and we have a fire pot, a cane kettle, sugar kettle, depending on where you're from, what they call. And then behind it, we have a firebox with a chimney that's used to heat that. Let's move in and take a little closer look. Most of these would have had some sort of, man, most all these outbuildings, just a wooden shelf to put supplies on while you were working. Any type of trough you'd have needed at that time, generally, unless you were wealthy and had connections overseas or in the northern states, would have been hand produced. You can see this trough was built out of a tree. The sugar kettle was usually surrounded with brick, hand laid, passage underneath to allow the heat to come into it. This is where they would have cooked the remnants out of those cane products. Here would have been where you could have put the fire in the side. You can't really see it, but to heat the kettle. And then the smoke, the heat would hit this and roll up, and the smoke would roll out of this chimney. And roll out the top. Let's take a pan from this side. We're standing on the side of the farm. So on top of all that, you'd had to produce everything that you've seen here and maintain between you and the people in your family. Most of the time, the size of your family dictated the size of the place that you had. You just didn't need anything bigger and didn't have the manpower at the time. This is pretty much what you're dealing with when they say a cracker home. And on these farms, keep in mind too, even vegetables they had to produce themselves. These usually consisted of mustard greens, beets, tomatoes, potatoes, sweet potatoes, watermelon, sugar cane, grapes, blackberries, any wild berries that they could find around. And to fertilize these was usually using the horse manure, pig manure, cow manure that they'd gathered off of their own place. And most of these homesteads had a milk cow. Kind of an interesting note, usually the oldest child of the family was responsible for taking care of that milk cow, milking that cow. He or she generally had to do that twice a day, early in the morning and late in the afternoon. Milk was essential, not just for drinking. That's how they produced their butter, their cheese, different things. An interesting note on corn cribs. Corn cribs were first introduced to our European settlers by the Native American Indians. So that completes our tour. That completes our tour of this Cracker Homestead. I hope it gives some of you a better idea, maybe that have never seen a Cracker Homestead, of what it looks like and what life would have been like here. A lot of you older generation, if you have children or grandchildren, you should take them to see things like this. Our cultural heritage is slowly being washed away and stripped away. And it's our job to teach those younger whippersnappers what's going on and what's happened in the past and where they come from, and to be proud of that. Thank y'all for joining me.